the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. Paul says, what if God made a trophy case? And in the trophy case, he put a whole bunch of things that he just loves and he wants to keep for a long time. And what if God also made a trash bin? And he put a whole bunch of things in the trash bin that he wanted to destroy in front of the trophy case just to prove how good he thought the trophy case was. What if God wanted to do that? Now, Paul isn't saying that God did that. Paul isn't saying that God created human beings just to send them to hell. He's not saying that. But he's saying if he did, that would be fine. Because he's God. What if he did that? Would you be okay with that? Is your God big enough that you let him make decisions like that? As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people. I will call her my loved one who's not my loved one. You notice Paul is not focusing on those who get destroyed. He's focusing on those who get brought in. And in the very place where it was said to them, you're not my people, they will be called children of the living God. Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of Israelites be like the sands by the sea, only a remnant will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence on earth with speed and finality. It's just as Isaiah said previously, unless the Lord Almighty had left us descendants, we would have become like Sodom. We would have been like Gomorrah. See, God really is that great, and we really are that messed up. If God hadn't done something to save from this planet some human beings, if he hadn't rescued some human beings to be his remnant, the whole thing would have gone the direction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what that passage says. Every one of us is on a path to deeper sin if God hadn't reached out to save us. Salvation depends on God's choice. And he has the right to choose the recipients of his mercy. We got a number of things left to hit, so let's keep moving. The next section, Paul says, well then what shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith, but the people of Israel who pursued the law as the way of righteousness have not attained their goal? Again, the question is God fair? Because the Israelites have worked hard to get righteousness. They've worked, they've followed the law, they've done everything that they knew to do. They've worked really hard. And yet the Gentiles are the ones who are given righteousness. The Israelites don't believe, therefore, according to Paul's message, the Israelites who don't believe are the ones headed for hell. And now all these Gentiles, the non-Jewish people who do believe, they're the ones who are headed for heaven. Based on Romans 1 through 8, that's the conclusion you have to make. And Paul says, is that fair? The Israelites have worked for it. Don't they get it? Listen, you probably know some people, and maybe you are one of these people, who says, I am working hard to please God so that he will let me into heaven. I'm working hard to get myself to there. And yet, it doesn't seem fair that someone else might on their deathbed just say, hey, listen, Jesus, forgive me, and he forgives them. That doesn't seem fair. Well, Paul asks that question. Let's find out what's wrong. Why not, verse 32? Because the Israelites pursued righteousness not by faith, but as if it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it's written, see, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And the one who believes in him will never be put to shame. Keep going. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God. But their zeal is not based on knowledge, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Listen, this is God's second point to Paul here. God's second point is that salvation has always been by grace, and righteousness is always by grace. See, the Israelites have been working to follow the law, but the problem with that is that if they were to live perfectly, whose righteousness is it? Well, it's theirs, not God's. See, if they live perfectly, they're righteous because they've accomplished it, not because God has given it. And we find out here that God doesn't care about your righteousness. Your righteousness isn't good enough. The Old Testament would even say all of our righteousness is like filthy rags to God. It's His righteousness. And it has always been by grace. It has always been something that God has just given by grace. Now, let's keep going. Now we're in verse 5. Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that is by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will ascend to the deep, descend to the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 30, Paul is quoting this section. And the basic point of what Paul is saying is, righteousness doesn't mean who of us is going to be perfect and they're going to go to heaven and bring this message of the law back down to us. Or who of us is going to be able to descend into death and bring back the secrets of death to us. Who's going to do that? And Moses back in Deuteronomy 30 said it's not about that anyway. It's about the word being in your heart and in your mouth. And even back in Deuteronomy 30, Moses was trying to communicate something that says the law isn't the thing. It's the condition of your heart and even your mouth that's important. And so Paul jumps off of that to get us to verse 9. The word is near you, it's in your mouth and your heart. That is the message concerning the faith that we proclaim. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it's with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there's no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Paul's point here is that grace has always been available to everyone. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Grace is available to everyone. That means that grace is more fair than works. Now check this out. We think fair is if I work harder, I get more rewards. We think that's fair. But in truth, when it comes to God, because everything I do isn't good enough for God, my righteousness isn't good enough for God's righteousness, because my righteousness is always tainted by sin. It's always just slightly less than perfect. Because my righteousness isn't good enough for God, then I've got this problem, you know? And I can work and I can work and I can work and I can work, but it's still not going to be enough. But grace is fair. Because see, there's some people, if it's based on works, some people know the law and some people don't. That's not fair. If it's based on works, some people are better with their brains and they can do things more easily than others. That's not fair. If it's based on grace, some people can't talk, so that means they can't swear. They can't sin that way. Well, that's not fair, because they have an easier time than someone else. If it's based on works, it's never going to be fair. But if it's based on grace, everyone's on the same playing field. Every human being who's ever been on the face of this earth just has to call out to God, and He'll save them. Now, that sounds a lot like my choice, doesn't it? I thought we were talking about God choosing us. In just a moment, we're going to have to put all these pieces together, but let's just keep moving. Grace is offered to everyone. The next section, we're in verse 14 now. How then can they call on the one they've not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they've not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they're sent? As it's written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Talking about the Israelites. We know they have to hear this message in order to believe the message, so did they hear it? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Again I ask, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I've held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. Here's the point. Israel had their chance. Okay? So is God fair to give this message to the Gentiles? Is God fair to base it on grace? Is God fair to choose who he will save? Yes, yes, and yes. Because everybody was on the same playing field of grace, and Israel had their chance, and they rejected it. Did they hear? Yeah, they heard, but they rejected it. And so God says, listen, I'm going to go after the Gentiles, and they're going to make you envious of this thing. So, is God unjust? No, he's exactly just. In fact, he's more just than we could possibly imagine by making it based on his gracious choice. Last big section here. We're in chapter 11. I'm just going to read verses 1 through 32. I ask then, did God reject his people? Did God reject the Israelites? By no means. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. So, did God reject all the Jews? No, because Paul's a Jew. And if you have one Jew, then that doesn't mean God rejected all the Jews. So, it's not that God rejected the Jews as a category. Keep going. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Did you know what Scripture says? Don't you know what Scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he appealed to God against Israel. Lord, they've killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left and they're trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? I've reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there's a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. Pause there for just a moment. It's the second time Paul has used that word elect. Earlier he used the word election. Now he uses the word elect. That means choice. That's plain and simple all it means. Election means God's process of choosing. Elect means those who have been chosen. So here it says, those who were elect achieved what they sought. What were the Israelites seeking? Righteousness. They were seeking God's righteousness, right? Those who were elect received it. This is where the God choice and the my choice find their link.